Oops, wrong film.
Apollo 13 flight controllers, give me a go, no go for launch. You know that.
For God's sake, wrong film again. Hang on.
I guarantee you that at some point, everything's gonna go south on you.
Ready?
And you're gonna say, this is it. This is how I end.
Commander, Mark is dead.
We have to go now.
Hello, and welcome to Film Rant. This week we review The Martian, directed by my local lad Ridley Scott. He lived just down the road from me. I know he's da. Nah, I don't really. But he really does come from just down the road from me. Claim to fame right there. This is another film I got to see early due to the Cineworld Unlimited screenings, in case you were wondering how this is up so early. This will contain spoilers for The Martian and 127 hours, so either wait a couple of days until it comes out in your area, or watch this right now and brighten your day up a bit. As usual, let's start with the characters. There's only really two characters worth talking about in this movie. The cast is huge, but only two characters really stood out to me. So let's start with the main man. Matt Damon took a break from fucking Sarah Silverman and plays astronaut Mark Watney. His character isn't unlike George Clooney in Gravity. He's quite arrogant, cocky and fearless, but he's incredibly lovable. He's very funny too actually, which is a really surprising element of the film, but I'll talk about that when we get into the script. His video diary scenes and banter with the crew are wonderful to watch. The only criticism I'd have of his character is that we never really see him scared, at least not until the very end of the movie. We also don't look into his past or see any of his family. I feel that a few shots of relatives back home willing him to come home wouldn't have gone amiss. It would have provided a little bit of depth to his character. He didn't lack it necessarily, but it would have made the jump from a great character to a perfect character. He's easy to support, and I suppose ultimately the movie makes us his family. We will him to get home. Jeff Daniels plays NASA director Teddy Sanders. He's made out to be a half villain in the sense that he wants to get Mark back but isn't sure about the cost, risking the lives of more crew or risking a PR disaster. He's partially against the rescue, but we can relate to him. It's very rare you get the chance to side against the hero. Teddy is not portrayed in a villainous light, he's portrayed in a very balanced way that allows the audience to relate to him, but still want him to ultimately bring Mark back. He could have quite easily been made into an emotionless government official style robot who simply just says, "No, Sean Bean, you can't bring him back. That's an order. Now get out of my office." Scott makes him very human, and it was wonderful to see Teddy's conflict with the rest of NASA and their rescue ideas. Now we'll talk about the script. There isn't much wrong with the script really. Most things I mention here could probably be explained by cutting to save runtime, but there's a few little niggles I have with the film. Firstly, the beginning scene sees Matt Damon being struck by a piece of an aerial in a storm on Mars. He is part of the Hermes 3 crew, and they are attempting to get to the... now we'll just call it an escape pod because I genuinely can't remember the spacey name for it. So yeah, his crew are attempting to get the escape pod and they realise Matt Damon has been hit. Visibility is poor and they need to move. So after a few moments of searching, the crew make the heartbreaking decision to leave Matt Damon on Mars. There's a sentence I never thought I'd say. Now this was a good scene, but I feel like the decision to leave him would have been much more powerful had we spent more time with the crew as a whole. It would have made us, like them, struggle to come to the decision to leave him, and we would feel the same emotions as the crew at the crucial decision point. However, to pull this off, you'd probably need to extend the film by about 20 minutes, and it already has a hefty runtime of 2 hours 21, and you can't really cut anything out, so I understand why Scott just dove straight into the second act. I also thought that the initial issues that Mark faced were solved a little too easily. He basically just outright goes, "Reet, so I'm a bit stranded on Mars here with enough scran to last us 31 days, so I'm going to have to grow some food on a planet where now grows." So straight off you're left thinking, aye, that's quite a predicament that, mate. But in the next scene he's having a wonderful space shit and has one of those glorious epiphanies you have while taking a shit and thinks, "Yeah, I can use these stinking turds in Mars's soil in order to grow some tatties." Belter. So within minutes he's solved the issue of food by growing potatoes. We may as well be calling this twat Alison McCain. Then comes the next issue. "Reet, so I've got me bait sorted, now I need something to wet me beak with. Now I'm on a planet with no water, so I'm going to have to make some." He then goes on to explain how you can make water with fire and some other shit. Now his first attempt results in a rather comedic explosion that blows him out of the tent area he's growing his crops in. It's played for laughs and it works wonderfully. However, he explains that it exploded because he didn't take into account the extra oxygen he was exhaling. So again, played for laughs, he steps in wearing a sort of tinfoil cape and his helmet. It's a great funny scene, but this time it works. So again, he solved the problem a little too easily and quickly for me. Considering we're at a stage in humanity where scientists are struggling to work out how to get water and food to grow on Mars, this stage of the movie felt really simplified and sort of took out the stakes. And that was the main issue for me for the first third or so of the movie. I felt like Matt Damon was going to be fine. I felt like he could live there for the rest of his life, no bother. He may as well just terraform Mars by himself and rule it. The issues presented in the trailer are the food and water issues, but since they're solved in about 10 minutes, I was thinking, right, okay, so what's the issue now? Just wait it out, right? The film proposed some other issues later, like how to contact NASA or keeping the batteries for his MAV charged, along with keeping warm in the MAV. But again, he solves all of these problems first time round and fairly easily. It would have been nice to see him struggle a bit. I know astronauts have vigorous training to come out alive in pretty much any situation, but come on, he has to struggle with some problems at least. I honestly thought it was going to turn into a short adventure film after half an hour as he tells the audience his plan to use the MAV to get to the Army's 4 escape pod, which is quite far away. I thought the rest of the film was going to be him waiting it out in the MAV until the next crew get there to rescue him. That was until Teddy said, "This plan will work, if nothing goes wrong." Hint hint. And boom! Just like that, something went wrong, and in a sick and twisted way, I was glad. We finally got to see Mark attack a difficult problem. His decompression chamber that attached to the base exploded and tore a hole in the tent where he kept his crops. Mars's atmosphere froze all of the crops and Mark had lost nearly all of his food. We briefly see Mark lose his shit in the MAV in the face of no food. But like many of the other issues, a few minutes pass and he half solves it. He can't grow any more food, but he masks off the hole with some duct tape and tarp. I tell you what though, this movie really advertises duct tape well. It seems that shit can fix anything, except maybe the Fantastic Four movie. Yes, I'm still fucking annoyed. The crops problem doesn't affect Matt Damon too much, but it simply accelerates NASA's rescue attempt. The time they have to rescue him is cut drastically shorter, and they have to find another way to rescue him, which I'll get to later. But now I want to talk about the film's lack of mental focus. Mark seems to be perfectly fine with pretty much anything Mars throws at him. Like I said earlier, he solves problems fairly easily. He realises when he wakes up that he's on Mars totally alone, and his reaction is pretty similar to what happens when you spill your drink. Sort of like, shit. Ah well, I'll just clean that up and everything is hunky-dory. He just gets on with it. For me, I would have liked to see him struggle mentally. They even have a line from one of the NASA guys that says, "Mark's just realised he's alone on Mars. Imagine what that does to a man psychologically." I think Ridley Scott's idea was to explore that, but he didn't really. Mark rarely shows any emotion, except when he loses his crops and he lets out a little anger, and when he finally gets in the pod to launch from Mars, he begins to cry. I'd imagine no matter what your training is, if you realise you're alone on Mars by yourself with not much food or water and no obvious means to contact NASA, you'd have a bit of a breakdown. There's a small segment at the end of the movie where he's explaining to a class, in this situation you either accept you're going to die or you work the problem. He prephrases this by saying, "Was I scared? Hell yeah I was." Maybe that's why Scott didn't have Mark show any emotion and use his humour as a defence mechanism. I can understand that logic, but I think it would have made for a slightly better film if we could see a psychological toll on Mark throughout the movie. A plot point that really stood out to me was that to get Mark home, NASA had to get help from the Chinese space program. NASA is shit out of luck when it comes to rescuing him in time as they try to send him some supplies by rushing a small lunar pod to him which explodes after launch due to the lack of inspection it received because of time constraints. The guys at NASA are left thinking, well shit, Mark seems up shit creek here like lads. Then comes a scene in which two people at the Chinese Space Agency, the CSNA, are seeing what's happened to Mark on the news. The male character says, their guy is going to die. The female then responds with, why don't we send them, insert name of rocket here. And the guy looks a little confused. He asks, won't that let them in on a few trade secrets? The lady nods and he's just like, aye, gone on then, I can live with that. This was a brilliant thing to see. Not only did it show the coming together of nations for the good of one man or even humanity itself, but it showed the coming together of America and China. China is a very closed-off independent country, so it was great to tell a story in which they became the knights in shining armour by letting go of all secrecy, trade secrets and distance in order to better the human species. It was a statement on how the world should be, without borders, without prejudice or war, become a species as one and venture into space together. An element of the script that really threw me off early on in the movie was that it's fucking funny. Like, really funny. So much so that it could probably be classed as a comedy. The banter between Mark and NASA is brilliant and his monologues are fantastic. There's little subtleties in the jokes too, like when Mark says, "I am the greatest botanist on this planet." Obviously, he's the only guy on the planet. He also goes on to explain that in terms of the law, he's technically in international waters, and he's doing a lot of things without permission, so that makes him a pirate. And he requests NASA to call him Captain Blondebeard. There's also a funny quip shortly after when one of the Houston operators explains why he said that, and the NASA guy interrupts saying, "Yeah, he's a space pirate, I get it." There's too many jokes to list them all, but all of them are incredibly genuine and don't seem forced. It's bizarre to see a realistic space sci-fi use comedy in such a heavy way. We get a little bit of comedy in Gravity and small parts here and there in Interstellar and Apollo 13, but ultimately they're really intense and dramatic. The Martian has its fair share of dramatic moments, but the comedy balances it out perfectly. Now I'll talk about the technical aspects of the movie, as the script is pretty much flawless other than those issues I've mentioned. It tells a great story, and it's very well written. I can forgive Scott for not including the things I've mentioned, as they would have all added a lot to the runtime. But following on from the comedy elements, the movie utilises a very strange motif with disco music. Mark's Ares team captain, Melissa Lewis, is the only crewmate who have brought some music to Mars. Throughout the film, Mark is constantly commenting on how terrible it is having to listen to disco all the time, and that she has terrible taste in music. There's a great joke where Mark says, "This is the least disco song she owns. Seriously." And the song is... The disco music is juxtaposed beautifully with the Mars landscape and Mark's personality. Even the lyrics make sense too. Obviously, I Will Survive with its title, but it also contains the line, "And so you're back from outer space." Scott also includes Waterloo by ABBA, which includes the line, "I couldn't escape if I wanted to." It was a wonderful play on words and fantastic direction, subtle comedy and a lovely audio-visual style. Ridley Scott fucking nailed it. Within the first 10 minutes of this movie, I worked out that it was going to be Apollo 13 mixed with 127 hours, and that's pretty much exactly what I got. Not that I'm complaining, Apollo 13 is one of my favourite movies of all time, and 127 Hours is my favourite human survival movie. So to slam them both together made me wish I'd brought some Kleenex into the screen because, you know, ejaculate and all that. The movie contains all of the suspense and drama of Apollo 13, along with allowing the audience to see what's happening with the crew and what's happening back at home in Houston. Both movies also gloriously portray that feeling of unity as a species, that regardless of who this guy is, he's out there in fucking space and we need to get him home to his family. He's one of us. When we jump to Matt Damon, that's when the film turns into 127 hours. Both movies share the video diary element, and in these scenes there's a strong element of comedy. The only real difference is that 127 Hours shows Aaron Ralston struggling psychologically, which I've mentioned The Martian lacks a little. 127 Hours also briefly shows Aaron hallucinating a conversation with his loved ones, which is also something that The Martian lacked. However, Matt Damon's character carries the film so well that these things are not too big a deal. There could have been another major parallel between this film and 127 Hours in the first few minutes. Mark finds himself impaled by an aerial and he removes it. He then needs to remove a shard that has snapped off and is still inside his body. We see a shot of him surgically removing the shard from himself, and he's wincing in pain. But it wasn't anything to make most people squirm. What Scott could have done is take a leaf out of Danny Boyle's book and use some brilliant sound design and camera work in order to portray real pain, like the arm amputation scene in 127 Hours. However, I can totally understand if Scott didn't do this simply because he felt it might be too graphic. The Martian is beautifully shot too. I mean, everything in space looks fucking fantastic, but some of The Martian is simply brilliant. The film opens on the Earth slowly being illuminated by the sun, and it sets the tone perfectly. Strangely, most of the memorable shots are framed for comedy purposes. I remember when I was in uni, my lecturer would say the best comedy shots are always wides. Ridley Scott does this when the failed attempt at creating water results in an explosion. It cuts to Mark being blasted away in a wide, and it was very funny. One shot that sticks to mind though is just before Mark is about to get in his escape pod. It shows this small man walking up to this gargantuan piece of technology in slow motion. It forces you to think of how small we are in the universe and what we can accomplish. The Martian is a film that cheers on humanity, and the cinematography reflects that at points. The CGI is fantastic too, to the point where I didn't even question anything at all. I absolutely believe Mark was on Mars, I believe the Hermes crew that left him were on a spacecraft, and I believe that they were really in space when they were outside the craft. Nothing was overdone or in your face. Everything was subtle and the CGI blended into the physical world very smoothly. Props to the effects team on this one, they've done a stellar job. The editing towards the end was fantastic. up until a point. In the climax of the second act, we have lots and lots of build-up. We see the Hermes team preparing to catch Mark in space after he launches himself off Mars via the escape pod. We see everyone at NASA watching the screens nervously along with the people around the world in various locales such as Times Square and Trafalgar Square. The music sweeps majestically in the background, and as Mark is lying there in the escape pod waiting to launch, knowing there's every chance he could die at this final hurdle, we finally see him break. He begins to cry and shake nervously along with letting out a few moans. This mix of shots, the music, and Matt Damon's acting brought about one of the best climaxes to a movie I've ever seen. It made the audience feel like those depicted on screen, crowding around the monitors in Times Square and at Houston. If he launched off Mars and into the loving embrace of the Hermes crew, I'd have been perfectly happy with that. But Scott chose to add in a few more issues towards the end. Mark's pod didn't quite get him high enough, and the Hermes crew had to spend another 10 minutes or so correcting that and the intercept velocity. I'm not sure if this is how it is in the book, but the 10 minutes or so slowdown sort of ruined the beautiful climax we had just before it. It just dragged it out a little too long for me, but I can understand if Scott wanted to keep to the book. The scene ends in a gravity-esque tether grab between the captain that left Mark on Mars in the first place and Mark himself, showing that no matter how far away you ever become from someone, you'll always find yourselves together again. Oh, isn't it sweet? It actually is. The first thing he says to her is, "You have terrible taste in music." Fantastic ending, but would have been better if it was a bit quicker. Finally, I want to mention a little thing Scott tried but didn't quite pull off. Throughout most of the movie, Matt Damon is totally clean shaven. Then about 2/3 of the way through, he sports quite a manly beard, for about 10 minutes. When he's about to make his final trip to the escape pod, we get a shot of him looking at himself in the mirror as he victoriously shaves his beard off. I guess Scott was going for the shedding of the skin imagery here. Mark is dumping his old Mars Survivor Man persona and returning home. This would have been much more effective had Mark donned the beard much earlier in the movie, sort of dragged it through the adventure with him before leaving it behind like an old friend. I still think it worked, but it would have been much more poignant had Scott introduced it earlier in the movie. Before I finish though, I want to say I feel absolutely fucking cheated. I mean, who does Ridley Scott think he is? Casting Sean Bean in a movie and not killing him? That's fucking unheard of. Give your heed a rattle, Scott. You aren't in any position to redefine cinema forever. In all seriousness though, The Martian is a wonderfully constructed, entertaining and gripping film. I'd have liked to see Mark struggle a bit more than he actually did, but nevertheless, the character-driven plot and their brilliantly acted and written dialogue was a pleasure to watch. The film produced a wonderful spectacle and stated a very positive message in that humanity should evolve into something better than we are right now. We should venture forth into space as one united species and nothing is too great. Every man counts and you can always rely on people to get you out of a mess. Okay, so here's the rub. The Martian gets a very respectable 4.5 frames out of 5. Thanks for watching and we'll see you next time on Film Rant.
Tell my family that I never stop fighting to make it home.